Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 141 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Doug Tallamy, author of Nature's Best Hope. The plant profile is on the Cornellian Cherry, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with Eva Monheim, host of the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, who shares the last word on trees with unique services. This episode, we're joined by Doug Tallamy. He is the author of Nature's Best Hope, and he is joining us this episode to talk about the new edition, the Young Readers Edition. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Kathy. Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. And I feel like just saying that you're the author of Nature's Best Hope is, not even giving you a tenth of your background and all your expertise. So let's talk a little bit about you and how you came to write that book, and you're bringing nature home, Nature's Best Hope, and the nature of oaks. And we always like to ask here on the GardenDC podcast, Doug, were you born with chlorophyll in your veins and a green thumb?
No, but I was born with nature in my veins.
Mm-hmm.
I was a typical little boy. I loved snakes and turtles, and I knew nothing about plants. So it was the love of life that brought me to plants eventually, and that was through insects. But I didn't meet insects until college. Took a course in entomology. But the love of nature and the interest in living things was there right from birth. It was a good way to put it.
And so you discovered entomology in college. Was that just a happen to be your science course that you took, or did you choose that as your major?
Well, I was a biology major,
Mm-hmm.
and the chairman of the department was Dr. Bugbee, believe it or not, and he taught a course in entomology, so I had to take it. But it was,
Yeah.
I like biology, but it was extremely interesting. And then I went on to grad school in biology. In entomology. What got me to your original question on how did I end up writing these books was the year 2000. My wife and I moved into it was a farm that had been broken up into 10-acre lots in southeast Pennsylvania, and it was completely overridden with invasive plants. And our goal was to restore it. But one of the things that I noticed right away is that, the local insects are not eating these plants. And that led to research on what the impact of non-native plants was having on our, not just our natural systems from invasive plants, but we extended that into home gardens and to managed landscapes. About 85% of our plants are from some other continent. What is that doing to local food webs? What is that doing to the little chickadee that wants to breed in your yard? And that has been the focus of my research ever since then. But one of the things I learned is the impact is huge. The problem is much bigger than I thought it was. And there's real urgency because we're hearing, we're getting these headlines, global insect decline, and we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And the U.S. says we're going to lose 1 million species in the next 20 years. These are disastrous things. And I guess the conclusion I've come to is we can do something about it. Each homeowner, each gardener, anybody who owns a piece of the earth can do something about it by managing the life on their property. And that has been my message ever since.
Yeah, those are some alarming things you're talking about, Doug. And I'm glad you're the one sounding that alarm and getting that message out. And before we dive into more of that message, because our listeners are diehard gardeners, they want to know a little bit about what you're growing and where you grow, maybe describe the soil in your zone and what you love to have in your garden.
Well, as I said, we're southeast Pennsylvania, so we're 7 something zone. It keeps changing all the time. Our soil is poor. My front yard is practically serpentine barrens. the rest of the property is not so bad. So, really what I'm growing is biodiversity, and I'm using the native plants that create it. So I call our landscape a restoration as opposed to a garden. I mean, yes, we are gardening the world, but we have restored the eastern deciduous forest and some eastern meadow here. It's been 22 years that we've been here, and the restoration has been enormously successful. So one of the things I've learned is you can put it back together again much easier than I thought, and much faster than I thought. But in terms of the plants that I favor, it's the ones our research has shown support the most biodiversity. And oaks would be number one. And we have, 12 species of oaks here. Woody plants are supporting more than herbaceous plants, but we have what I call keystone plants, the ones that are creating most of the food that supports most of the animal life. And it turns out just 14% of our native plants are doing most of that work. They're supporting 90% of the food web. So I focus on those. But any plant that wants to join our little ecosystem here is more than welcome. Our biggest challenge is deer, overabundance of deer, because I plant something and it's gone the next day, and that's really, really frustrating. So
I was just going to say that deer is a 4-letter word on this podcast, and we love them. They're beautiful creatures, but the destruction of especially our native forests is just rampant.
Yeah. That is for sure. The frustrating thing is we know how to control them, but that becomes a sociological problem, not an ecological one. We need permission to do that. It's a challenge, but the not controlling our deer has devastated the forest. It has devastated our ground biodiversity. It's increased the challenge from invasive plants because the deer eat the natives and leave the non-natives, and that shifts the competitive balance. Our natives are actually very competitive, but not when they're eaten, when they're 2 inches tall. And it's created the giant Lyme disease problem. I've had Lyme disease 5 times. I'm getting tired of that. And it's all because of overabundance of deer.
Wow. Yeah, sorry to hear about the Lyme disease. That can be, really devastating.
Yeah, fortunately I get all the symptoms. I get the big bullseye, and I can treat it right away, and I haven't had any long-lasting problems. But there are a lot of people that don't get the bullseye, and then they don't know, and then when you don't treat it, it's a real issue.
Yes, so be on the lookout for that bullseye pattern. Cover up and wear long sleeves, long pants as much as you can out in the garden, especially in shrubby type areas, right?
Right. And May and June are at least where we live, are the primary months of infectivity. You can get it any time of the year, but that's by far when you have the most infected ticks out there. So be particularly vigilant then.
And take it from an entomologist, right?
You know what? I've got a little hint here, and you're not hearing it from me, but if you get a deer tick and you pull it off, put Neosporin on the site immediately. Because it takes many hours for the Borrelia that's the Lyme disease infective agent, to actually get into your capillary system. So if you put Neosporin on where the tick was, it kills it before it gets into your blood. And that is really effective, believe it or not. And it's so easy. There's no downside to it.
Yeah, okay. I am adding Neosporin to my shopping list right now.
Yeah.
And my medicine cabinet. And so going back to one of the things you said, keystone species. I've heard a little controversy about that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I don't know. What is the controversy?
I think that people are saying that we're relying too heavily on keystone species, or that it should be more of a diversity, and that might be some of the controversy behind it.
Well, first of all, you want a diversity of keystone species. When I say 14% of our native plants, that's still a lot of plants. The reason I bring this up is that we have been, we've always gardened for aesthetics. And then when we have a switch towards native, we still are gardening for aesthetics. And some of our most beautiful natives are not the most productive in terms of supporting the food web. So my position has been, the keystone plants are the 2x4s in the ecological house that you're building, and they're essential. So because they're the support system, you can't build a house out of wallpaper. But once you have them, yes, you do want to diversify. Diversity is the key to stability. So I certainly don't fight that at all. But there are people that they're very happy they have an ITA in their yard and it supports some pollinators. It doesn't support a single caterpillar, which means if that's all you have, you can't have any breeding birds because it takes thousands of caterpillars to get one clutch of bird to the point where they mature. So I'm just saying, let's add those keystone plants any chance we get. But we're not, I'm not against diversity either.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of your principles in Nature's Best Hope was a mix. I think the percentage was 70% native, 30% non-native, correct?
Yes, correct. But that comes from one study from my PhD student, Desiree Narango. And it's the only study that has been done. And it was huge. It was a 5-year study, big NSF supported, whole bunch of interns. That showed, the question was, how well does a landscape that's dominated by native plants support chickadee populations compared to a landscape dominated by non-native plants? And the results were that you actually can maintain a food web capable of supporting breeding chickadees with as many as 30% of your plant biomass non-native. But that's one bird, one study in one place. And I know it's been extrapolated. People all over the country are saying, well, 70%. It's a good starting point, but it's definitely a case where more is better. But it did show, yes, there is room for compromise. You can have your crepe myrtle, you can have your ginkgo. We really can't tolerate any invasive plants because they're just ecological tumors. They don't stay where we plant them and they multiply. But there's a lot of ornamentals that are not invasive. And it doesn't mean, if we're going to landscape for ecological function, we can have attractive plants from other places as a compromise. But when they become dominant, then you really do lose the food web.
So I'm glad to hear I don't have to throw out my beloved peonies. And I just love that statistic, the 70-30, because it makes it accessible to the home gardener, the homeowner who's, afraid of tearing out everything and switching 100% to natives overnight. They feel like, there's this edict or this weight on their head to do it immediately and get that done. But I think a gradual transition and that goal of 70-30 makes it more doable.
Right. And remember, it's 70-30 biomass. If you have one large oak tree in your yard, that's a lot of biomass. So it's not counting the number of plants you have. It's the amount of biomass you have of those powerful natives versus other things. So you actually could have more numbers of species of non-natives as long as it's balanced by a goodly biomass from the productive natives.
Yeah, I have 4 huge oaks on a tiny urban lot, and I feel like that is 90% of my biomass.
We're doing well. That's right.
Yeah. So I'm like, could fill in with the other things, but I do grow a lot of natives, and some of those, because we're talking mainly to a mid-Atlantic audience, let's talk about some recommended species to add to your garden that would support both those caterpillars and the birds that eat them.
Right. Well, all right, let's move to herbaceous plants briefly. If you look at the plants that are best at supporting pollinators and caterpillars, the number one in our area would be any one of the solidagos, the goldenrods. Support 110 species of caterpillars, and they support a number of species of specialist bees. If you're making a pollinator garden, you want to plant for the specialist bees, the bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants, because the generalist bees can use those plants as well. If you only plant for the generalist bees, you lose all the specialists. And we've got about 4,000 species of native bees in this country, and over 1,000 of them are specialized, and we don't want to lose those. So goldenrods would be way up there. Our native asters are way up there. Perennial sunflowers are way up there. If you have those 3 genera in your yard, there's up to 44 species of specialist bees that can use your yard as a place to reproduce that won't be there if you don't have those 3 types of plants.
And in the asters, you're definitely talking about, of course, native asters because there are asters all over the world.
Yes. Yes.
And what I love about those selections you just named is they are late season bloomers, so they really extend the bloom, and perennials, of course.
But we can't ignore those early season bloomers. And of course, if you're focusing on pollinators, redbud is an essential early season bloomer. Native willows, native pussy willow, Salix discolor. They'll be coming out. Actually, if you're down in DC, they might be out already. And they're a very important source for those first season bees. And I mentioned oaks earlier as being the best in terms of making caterpillars, and they are. They support more than 950 species of caterpillars nationwide. But even though they're wind pollinated, they also help the pollinators. Those male catkins hang down and loaded with pollen. And if you get your binoculars out and just train it on some of those catkins, you'll see the native bees are going there and removing the pollen all day long. Now they're not pollinating because they're not moving into the female flowers of the oaks, but oaks are supporting our pollinators. So it's another benefit of those plants.
Well, that makes me feel better, Doug, about, I call them the tumbleweeds that fall when all those catkins
Oh
come
yeah,
down,
yeah.
and your garden is just covered in these brown balls of the late catkins, but they're fun to mulch with and to add to your compost pile.
And to fill up your gutters, I know.
Yes, that as well. Yeah, don't park under a oak tree at that point in the season.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a shaggy rain at that point.
Yes, that, and then the yellow pollen that falls from the pines. Well, it's all part of life. It's there pluses and minuses, and there's some things we have to put up with. But this is another important message that I keep trying to get out: is that nature's not optional, and there are some downsides, but it is what keeps us alive on this planet, and we have to landscape in a way that supports it for our own good. And if that means acorns on the ground sometime or pollen on our windshield, that's okay. I like to compare it to telephone poles. Telephone poles bringing us electricity. They're ugly as sin, and nobody ever complains. Nobody ever says, "I don't like them. I'm going to go chainsaw them down," because we know they're absolutely necessary, and there are parts of nature that are absolutely necessary as well that we just have to start accepting instead of just saying we're going to remove all of it.
I love that. Nature is not optional. And so, in the new version of Nature's Best Hope, which is directed at young readers, what is the age group, and why did you feel the necessity of coming up with a second version aimed at younger readers?
Well, the age group is it's hard to say because the kids differ so much in their reading abilities, but I would say 8 to 12 was probably the target. Middle schoolish. Some of it is written a little bit younger than that, but when you get above that, there's the original version, Nature's Best Hope, is not over their heads. Why do we want to do this? Because the kids on this planet are the future stewards of that planet. And right now they are so disconnected from nature. And if you listen to the media when it talks about nature, it's almost all negative. If you go outside, you're going to, a mosquito's going to kill you, or something terrible will happen. And it's just a big turnoff for our kids. So the message has been, you have to fear nature, stay away from it. Screen time is what life is all about. And yet these are going to be the future stewards of our planet. So the message in Nature's Best Hope is, no, you are nature's best hope. And if you buy into the fact that nature's not optional, that means it is you who's going to take care of this planet. And not only are you going to take care of the planet, it is your responsibility to do that. Because we all need healthy ecosystems, every one of us has a responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems, not just the tree huggers, not just a few ecologists. And that's a message I want to get, I'm working to get it to all the adults out there, but the kids as well. We got to focus on the kids. So we're hoping this will take off in school systems, maybe be used in some coursework or after school activity. I'm not sure. It hasn't really been released yet at the end of March, and we'll just see how it goes.
Yeah, that's great that it's coming out in a few weeks. And the subtitle, How You Can Save the World in Your Own Yard. I love that. It's so empowering.
That's it. The planet has huge problems, and more people recognize that, but they all feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can do a lot, and that's what we outline in the book. All the things that you can do, from as easy to changing the light bulb over your front porch from a white bulb to a yellow bulb. That will reduce the number of insects that are killed every night during the summertime. Very easy to do, but have a huge impact.
And in the book, you have a chapter on Homegrown National Park. And if you look that up in the National Park Service website, you're not going to find it as a location. So can you define that to our listeners?
Yeah. Well, 78% of the country is privately owned. 85% of the country east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So if we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail. And as we've already mentioned, we can't afford to fail. We have to start, our parks and our preserves are islands surrounded typically by no man's land. So what we need to do is, if we practice conservation on private property, that's all the area in between those parks. Create viable habitat where we actually live and work and play. Then our preserves are not islands. Then the populations within them are not so tiny. So when they fluctuate, they won't just blink out and disappear, because that's what's happening right now. Well, who's going to do that? It's property owners for the most part. And they don't know that that's what they're supposed to do. They don't, all the things we just talked about, most people don't have a clue about it. So Homegrown National Park was it's a small nonprofit co-founded with Michelle Alfanderi, and she was actually a perfect example of the non-choir. She had just retired from a marketing job in Manhattan. Knew nothing about biodiversity or the biodiversity crisis or conservation or anything else. But she heard me give a talk and said, you really have to get this message to people just like me. We don't know anything about this. And she came with the concept of getting on the map. So the object is to register your property where you live at Homegrown National Park. And it's free, by the way. And the amount of area that you're going to start to landscape in an ecologically responsible way. Maybe you're going to reduce the area of lawn, because lawn isn't helping us much. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put that aster in a flower pot. Whatever you do, you're going to record that area, and then that information goes onto the map, and your little piece of your county will light up, and you get to see who else has joined Homegrown National Park. But the object is to enlist the millions of people out there. That's this grassroots army that can participate in conservation to turn around the biodiversity crisis, so we don't see these headlines all the time. If we put the right plants back where we live, work, play, and to a lesser extent farm, we really can. We can turn around those bird losses. We can turn around many of the terrible statistics we're seeing. And it's not an if, it's when we do it, because it's our only option. We have to do it. So Homegrown National Park it's kind of a social media approach to getting the message to the non-choir people. Your state will be color coded with how many people are participating. And the darker green you are, the better your state's doing. And that creates a competitive aspect to it. So it's young. We're in our second year, but we've got, about 24,000 members at this point, and it's growing rapidly. So we're pleased.
Wow, 24,000 is impressive.
With 24,000, it's really families. So if you count the number of people in those families, it could be closer to 100,000. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times on the podcast, we cover that kind of friction between local regulations and or sometimes HOAs and what we can grow in our own yards. Is that part of that campaign?
Well, it is a friction, historically a serious one. It's becoming less and less. There's this idea that if you use native plants, it's going to be wild and ugly and lower property values. And back in the 70s, people really took that to heart, and they wrote some very strict homeowner association rules. Everybody has to have the same plants and the same height grass and so on. First of all, it's not true. If you do a good job landscaping, it's not going to lower your property value. And we're actually getting to the point where it is increasing property values. We do want to landscape without giving up aesthetics. Well, I say we should reduce the area of lawn, but not get rid of it. It's a cue for care. And the lawn we keep should be manicured. It's where we should walk because it's the perfect plant to walk on. We're just going to have more plants in our yards rather than 2 or 3 acres of lawn. We do have 44 million acres of lawn right now, which is an area bigger than New England. And it's dedicated to an ecological deadscape because it's a status symbol. We can have our status symbol and have less lawn, and we could do it without violating any of the HOA regulations if we do it tastefully. There was a couple in Maryland, I'm sure you've heard about it, who fought the lawn, and the lawn lost. Then they sued their HOA saying, we want to have our plants in our yard, and they won. So there's now a legal precedent for HOAs to not push this too much. But we want to respect the culture. We do want to change the culture to where the normal landscape has a lot more plants in it than it used to have. And it's happening. It's happening. The nursery industry is recognizing that there is a real market in native plants. They're carrying more of them. We're still at a point where the demand for natives exceeds the supply. So now we have business opportunities. We need to grow what I call native plant landscapers or ecological landscapers. There are a few around, but we need many, many more because most people really don't garden. Most people just hire somebody. I'd like to replace the whole mow, blow, and go industry with trained ecological landscapers so they can come and put in the plants we need, maintain them. Nobody's going to lose their job, but we're going to do it in a way that actually supports the life around us. That's the ultimate goal. And none of that should conflict with homeowner association rules.
And to convert part of that horticulture industry from, the mow and blow landscape guys into what you're describing, it will probably take some type of training or certification program. Is any of that in the works?
Yeah, a few here and there. We've got one at the University of Delaware. Not nearly enough, though. Not nearly enough. So now people they're putting out their shingles with their own experience. I have nothing against that. But yeah, you're right. We need some organized certification programs. I'm not sure, maybe through master gardeners. I talk about all these things. Everybody expects me to do it. I need a little help here, but
yes. Yeah. As the messenger, you're also always tasked to be the doer. And that's two
exactly
different
right.
things, that's really tough. But, there is a Chesapeake Bay landscape certification in the
Yes.
Mid-Atlantic, so that can start there. And of course, self-taught and self-experience, and somebody who is a professional landscaper who was to read your books and to really, grasp those messages, I think could do well.
Yeah, it is happening. It is happening, and it's accelerating. So, so people say, "What gives you hope?" That's what gives me hope. People are listening. People are eager when they hear there's actually something they can do personally and see the results. They get excited about that. There's very few environmental issues where you can do anything but throw up your hands. But this is when you really can do something. You can see the results. You can see the life come to your yard. I always use what's happened at our house. We put the plants back, and my research has shown if you know the number of moth species that are making a living in a particular food web, you have an index of how stable and how productive that food web is. In other words, how many other species can it support? So I've been counting the number of moths that are making a living at my house now. I've got a picture of each one of them. And I'm up to 1,199 species of moths that have come back since we put the plants back. So that's enormously encouraging. It says this really does work. We've got 60 species of birds that have bred here, not flew by, but bred here because we've got all that bird food. So it works. And that's really encouraging.
Yeah, I love that it's a positive message because, Doug, I have been to so many like environmental programs, talks, films, documentaries that kind of end like with a wah wah.
Yeah.
They don't
Mhm.
really help with the solution. They
I
just point
know.
out the errors of our ways, but
Right.
then kind of leave you really depressed.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's not the solution. Okay, we know what the problem is, but now we need to spread the message that we are the solution, which is this that's where that title comes from. Nature's best hope. We all are nature's best hope.
Yay. And so I know that you are doing some work or had done some work with Mount Cuba, and we've had several staff from Mount Cuba on the podcast before talking about their trials of native plants and the cultivars. And when you talked about the availability of native plants at local nurseries, that's one of the cruxes, right? That we have as a home gardener is sourcing native plants and then making that decision, should we do straight species, is one of the cultivars better or just as good?
Right. And the answer is it depends. So, we as humans, we want a black and white answer, yes or no, but it's just not that simple. Whether or not the cultivar is as good as the straight species at some ecological function depends on what the genetic trait was that created the cultivar to begin with. Many cultivars are found in nature. They're natural variants, and somebody's brought them in and then cloned them and put a name on it. Many of them. Others have been actively selected for, but whether or not that increases or decreases the ecological value, again, depends on what the trait was. We did an experiment at Mount Cuba. It was a 3-year common garden experiment looking at traits of woody plants. So it wasn't about flowers. It was about, whether you took a green leaf and made it red or purple, whether you had variegated leaves, whether you made a tall plant short, whether you enhanced berry size, the typical cultivar traits that you see in the industry all the time. And the only one that decreased insect use consistently was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because that loads the leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. The other cultivar traits didn't reduce insect use at all. My only caveat, and Mount Cuba, by the way, is doing some wonderful trial garden experiments looking at a whole bunch of cultivars of flowering plants to see which ones are servicing the pollinators and which ones aren't, because some of them don't and some of them do. The one caveat I would add is that I wish we could find a way to propagate these cultivars and maintain genetic variability at the same time. When you clone them, you've lost all the genetic variability, and we know in any age, but particularly the age of climate change, genetic variability is that's the mechanism by which our plants are going to adapt to all these serious changes we're throwing at them. So I tell people, I'd love to see nurseries carry the straight species along with the cultivars, and then you can decide. Right now, if you go to a nursery, it's very often the cultivar only. They don't even have the straight species. We know the straight species work. The cultivars sometimes work. There are examples where they actually work better. The Phlox paniculata jenna. It was a natural variant found in Georgia. It has twice the flowers on it as the straight species, and yes, it supports twice the pollinators. So, that's good. But we'd love to maintain that genetic variability so that we can provide the stuff that makes natural selection work for the future of our plants in our gardens.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a tough conundrum because, with as a grower or a wholesaler or a breeder of plants, you want consistency in
Exactly.
product, of course, and you want to be able to guarantee that for the retailers and the seller. And then, of course, for the grower, the home gardener, the consumer at the end wants that consistency and kind of that guarantee that it's going
Mm-hmm.
to do well in their climate.
Yeah.
Hmm. So breeders out there, get to work. But yes, I go to a lot of native plant sales and to garden club swaps, and that's a great place to source your native plants as both those, because usually people have goldenrod to spare or asters to
Mhm.
spare,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
which is great, and that's from your local ecosystem if you're going to your local garden club swaps. And so I know you're super busy writing these books and giving talks, but you're also a professor. Is that University of Delaware, correct?
That's right.
And I wanted to ask a little bit about your university students and what you're seeing and any changes in the past decade or so of teaching, in their attitudes and what they're curious and what they're asking about?
Well, I'm in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology. So the students that come to our department are already interested in nature. They're interested in conservation. So it's a very biased sample. I do get inquiries from students all over the country. Can I come be your graduate student? Plenty of interest there, far more than I have the money to support. So I think the students are reflecting the general public's increase in conservation, increase in finding ways to address these serious issues that they're reading about in the New York Times or the Washington Post. They want to do something about it. The students at the University of Delaware, I've been there 42 years, and the quality of student that goes to the university now is considerably higher than it was 42 years ago. So we got some good students. What we don't have is the resources to support all the students that want to study this. So that's a problem across the country, I think.
And the careers they're going on to, what type of jobs would they be taking post graduation?
The state jobs in conservation or wildlife agencies in Delaware, they're just dominated by our students. They go out all over the country. We have students working in zoos. The head of the primate center at the Philadelphia Zoo is our student. Many students go on to graduate school, so they can either go into academia or research. The huge conservation organizations like Conservation International and National Wildlife Federation. There's Sierra Club. All of these people are hiring our students at one level or another. That's the first question that parents ask us when they come in. Can my son or daughter get a job? And the realization that we do need to actively put the earth back together again is spreading. I mean, look at the UN's 30 by 30 initiative. We're going to save 30% of the planet by 2030. That's a great goal. But it's going to take people to do that, and they need to be trained. So I am looking for an increase in the number of available jobs in conservation organizations over the next coming years. I've been saying that for a while now, but we are seeing a lot more public interest in it. So I think it's going to happen. But it's not enough right now. We need more of these paid positions. You need to be able to make a good, have a good career doing this, or it's not going to attract people.
I agree. And I think the funding will come eventually, but it just needs to be politically pushed,
Right.
is one way to phrase it. The priorities have to be conveyed to the politicians.
Yeah. I think we're lucky in so far, everything becomes politicized. It's red or it's blue. But everybody needs a healthy environment. Even people who pretend they don't, they do. And I think that has helped keep the contentious political rivalry out of many of these conservation issues, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I thought I would get pushback from a whole bunch of people, but I really haven't gotten it. People are on board, and that's encouraging to me. Red or blue, conservative or not.
I agree. Yeah, I think it's just a matter, when I say politically, of budgeting. It's not a matter of, whether it's one party or the other who is behind it, but it's priorities over of course, there's other priorities in school and policing
Right.
and that sort of thing. And all of those are important, but what piece of the pie is the environment going to get?
Yeah. And that's the tough one because it's a new piece of the pie. It's not new. People are just seeing it for the first time. So all the old problems still exist. Now we're asking for money to support this as well. And that we have to kind of sneak in there and say, we need a piece of that pie as well.
That's a tough one, but something to keep on working at.
Yeah.
And Doug, I was going to ask, who are your influences? Because I'm hearing about these university students going on to great things, and we could call them the Tallamy acolytes or disciples that are spreading that message throughout the world and the nation. But I bet there was somebody in your past or some buddies who brought these messages to you.
Yes, there certainly were. I mentioned Dr. Bugbee at Allegheny College back in 1972. he's the one that got me on this track. But as soon as I got to graduate school, I started reading about E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson from Harvard, and I read all of his books. He just died the day after Christmas 2 years ago. But he was kind of my academic god the whole time. Had the pleasure of meeting him several times. So he, not only did he tell us biodiversity exists, it's really important, it's disappearing, and this is how you save it. He did that consistently throughout his entire career. And for a long time, he was, a voice crying in the wilderness. But of course, now that he's gone, things are really accelerating. There's the E.O. Wilson Half Earth Society. We're going to save 50% of the earth. And these are real things that exist now. And it's all because of his work.
Yeah, he was a great man. And I think not enough people are even aware of his work. And I hope that some of his publications and things are more widespread now.
Yeah, well, I hope so too. He wrote a lot of books, and he wrote them for the public. He was a really smart guy, and I think that if he had a downside, it was that he was writing above the average public's head, and so they're not finding them as accessible as they could have been. But he wrote a book, I think it was 1990 or 1992, just called The Diversity of Life. It's still a great book. It starts out talking about how after the big volcano in Krakatoa exploded, wiped out all the life on that island, and then people studied how it came back, and that's a positive message right there. Even if you're starting with bare rock, biodiversity will return if you give it a chance. But that's a great read for anybody who wants to be introduced to this subject. It's dated, but not out of date. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it makes total sense. And that does bring up what we've said on the podcast before, that plants want to live. As gardeners, we're kind of the stewards, the nurturers. Giving the right plant in the right place a chance, helps it along a bit. But a lot of times you can just plop it in the soil and walk away, and it'll do just as fine without you.
Yeah. Well, I love how you say, gardeners are stewards of plants, which makes them stewards of everything. Because, of course, it's plants that capture the energy from the sun and turn it into the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So losing our plants is not an option. And what's the figure? 40% of our plants are now in danger, some crazy thing like that. We need to save the plants. We need to save all the plants. And gardeners are in better position to do that than anybody.
And for gardening practices, there's kind of the two major schools of gardening, which are the collector gardeners and kind of the landscape that design a beautiful garden and like the whole feel overall versus the individual plants. Where do you fall on that spectrum, Doug?
I'm definitely more in the landscape aspect of it, and I go beyond. That's why I really don't talk about gardens, because people have this image: the garden is that little patch of your yard next to the front porch that you work on, and everything else doesn't count. I say everything else does count. Every square inch of your property is part of your landscape. And what you do with those square inches is going to determine how much life can exist in your garden, your space, your landscape on your property. So I push beyond the design. I'm not a landscape designer on any level. To conservation. What can we do to our landscape that will allow us to share our landscape with the most other species in a very productive and fun and educational and healthy way? All the research showing that the health benefits to humans when you interact with plants or other parts of nature, it's astounding, the wonderful things that happen when you spend a little time staring at a tree. It's really amazing. So it's just, win-win-win all the way around. And that's what I've been focusing on. It's really the big picture.
Great. And how can our listeners contact you or follow up for more information?
Well, the best source of information about all of this would be homegrownnationalpark.org. It's all there in one form or another. Or we could buy one of my books. That'll help.
Yes. And I was going to say, you didn't plug your book, and I will definitely put a link to both the Nature's Best Hope and the new version for young readers coming out in our show notes. And any final thoughts, Doug, for home gardeners looking to have more diversity, more natives in their landscape?
I guess, since we're focusing on gardeners at this point, I would point out that you have the potential to be a model for all of your neighbors. This is how we ought to do it. You don't have to say a word. You don't have to go proselytize or knock on anybody's door. Just make a wonderfully attractive, productive landscape, and enough neighbors will say, "Hey, I want that too." And that's how we change the entire culture. So it puts all of our gardeners in a very powerful position.
That's wonderful. I think gardening by example is
Yes.
a terrific way to teach, rather than berating people or, chastising them for doing it the wrong way. Showing them the right way is always the best way.
Right.
Well, thank you, Doug, for sharing your book, for your knowledge, and your passion.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I always appreciate it.
Cornus moss plant profile. Cornellian cherry, Cornus moss, is a small tree or large shrub in the dogwood family. It is deciduous and blooms in the late winter into early spring. The flowers are a clear yellow and are held out on short stems along the branches. It is native to Western Asia and Southern Europe. It is hardy to USDA zones 4 to 8. It grows best in full sun to part shade in average soils. Cornellian cherry is deer-resistant and low maintenance. It is a good choice for an urban street tree because of its small size and tough nature. Remove any root suckers as soon as you see them emerge to control its spread. Cornellian cherry gets its common name from the fruits it produces in midsummer. These are edible, though a bit astringent. They are quite good processed into jams, jellies, and syrups. The fruits are also eaten by birds and squirrels. Cornus moss, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, I'm happy to report the little Scylla Siberian squill are popping up and looking adorable right now. And I spent some time up at the Philadelphia Flower Show and posted over 300 photos to our Washington Gardener Magazine Facebook page, so you can check those out there. It was quite the immersive experience, jumping into spring, and lovely as always. In the local gardening world, some upcoming events you might want to attend include the U.S. National Arboretum's Flowering Cherry Symposium, Connecting Cultures, Japanese Flowering Cherries in America. Takes place Saturday, March 18th, 1 to 4:30 p.m. at the auditorium in the administrative building of the U.S. National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. You can register for that and find out more details at usna.usda.gov. The cost is $20 for the general public, $16 for FONA and NBF members. Also happening that same afternoon is the Maryland Native Plant Society's hybrid program and field trip, Foraging and Cooking with Invasive and Non-Native Plants. So it is again Saturday, March 18th at 3 p.m. There's an online component and an in-person component at the Miller branch of the Howard County Library. You can find out more about that and register at mdflora.org. The following day, Sunday, March 19th at 2 p.m., the Potomac Rose Society celebrates spring by sharing their favorite roses. So sign up for their Zoom at potomacriose.org, and the member event is open to non-members and free to all, but they would love for you to join the Potomac Rose Society again at potomacriose.org. And then finally on Monday, March 20th, the Silver Spring Garden Club is hosting a talk on Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. And Keith Tomlinson will be sharing his experiences and knowledge about this wonderful public garden. The Silver Spring Garden Club meeting is free and open to the public. It takes place at 7:30 p.m. that evening at Brookside Gardens Visitor Center Auditorium. You can find out more details about that at silverspringgardenclub.com or .org and at the Silver Spring Garden Club Facebook page. Happy gardening!
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with the new book Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional, everyday grass lawn. In the last 3 years alone, over 23 million American adults converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now are looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn is knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Author Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the details on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Available at bookstores now and also at Quarto.com, where you can get 30% off using discount code GARDENING30. In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spade, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. Whether you're growing edible plants or beautiful flowers, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Hello, my name is Eva Monheim, and I'm from the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. Today I wanted to talk about the different types of trees that there are, the functions that they provide, and one is a way for a plant to search for water in a dry area. Some trees have the ability to put down a very, very deep root that will pull up water to the surface of the soil. And that type of plant, considered to be a pioneer species, will actually be there to create an environment for other plants to settle in. So if it's a barren area, or if it's in a city setting where you have a lot of concrete, for example, Paulownia will push down a root very, very deep and pull up water to the surface. It actually happens to like limestone soils. And its main purpose in life is to be a deconstructionist, breaking up rock, breaking up concrete, and bringing the water to the surface. Then after it starts to drop its leaves, it actually makes a layer of organic material so that something else can come in to grow in this uninhabitable area. Another plant that has a wonderful characteristic is the willow, the group of willows. And willows are usually found in riparian areas, and their purpose is to create a thick mat of roots to hold back soil particles so they don't erode into the water. And one of their key characteristics is the ability to regenerate from a cutting or broken stem. So if a tree drops a limb onto the ground, that limb has the potential to root very quickly, especially when the water is pretty high and the soil is very wet. They can put out their roots very quickly. Within a matter of weeks, they can have a whole root system developed. Their branches will fall, but also they're very early bloomers, and they provide wonderful nectar for early pollinators. That's another type of plant, one that actually holds back soil as opposed to breaking up soil. Then there are other plants that actually are very large and very fibrous rooted, and they're actually stabilizers. When I say stabilizers, they try to keep the status quo. For example, in a woodland, a very big tree, like a lindera, not a lindera, but a tulip tree, Liriodendron tulipifera, they are also not only deep-rooted, but they also have a very fibrous root system that allows for the soil to be inhabited by other plants, smaller plants, like grasses or carex. I want to say carex, or some annuals that would typically grow in a woodland. And it also drops its lower limbs for a very good reason, because it allows for other trees to come in that are understory trees. Those understory trees provide additional habitat for other creatures. For example, an American holly growing underneath a tulip tree allows for layering of the forest atmosphere so that there is plenty of layers for animals to live within. So there's lots of different types of actions that trees provide that we really don't think about. We see them together or separately, and especially when we have a plant on our front lawn, we see the tree solitary, and we really don't know what its full function is until it's in its natural environment. And we think of an oak tree, for example, when it's on our front lawn, it could get very big and wide. But if it was in a woodland, it would be tall and narrow so that it can get the light from the top of the woods, and it would be a canopy tree, along with the tulip tree, along with maybe some hickories. And it would also provide a space underneath itself so that other plants can grow, like smaller story trees, as I mentioned with the tulip tree. You might have dogwoods growing underneath it, or you might have a redbud growing underneath it. And a redbud, for example, growing in a woodland provides nitrogen for the soil because it fixes nitrogen on its root system. And those nodules provide nitrogen for the surrounding soil and for surrounding organisms that might be living in the area. So we have this coexistence of plant material that allows for layering and also for sharing resources. Sometimes trees will actually provide water for another tree if it has so much, or if a tree has so little that it can actually take from another tree or give to another tree. Those things happen all the time, but we just don't see it and we're not aware of it. But those functions do happen. Also, another thing is that the edge of a woodland is critical because that's a great area for our native bees. They can actually burrow into the soil and have a place to live close to plants that may be in bloom, and especially along the ecotone of the woodland, which is what it's called, where you have a shrubby border. And that shrubby border may have lots of blooming plants, and those bees are very close to those plants to pollinate. So there's lots of different types of trees that function in different ways. And we can't think of them all functioning the same way because it's just like people. They don't all have the same profession, or they don't function the same way in a particular setting. Each one has its own, I would say, talents for being in nature. So that's my talk for today. And my name is Eva Monheim, and I'm with the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at WashingtonGardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.